Hey guys, welcome to About Ukraine, and in this video we're going to talk about how everything bad about Ukraine came from Russia. And these are my personal theories. I have 4 reasons why I'd like to think this way, and I'm going to go over this in this video. Did you notice something about Russian mindset and I guess the Russian culture where indignation is always suppressed by fatalism, and fear and suffering and loss are always more readily accepted than they are in the West? The Russian religious philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev once said that Russia is a country of unbelievable servility and terrible humility, a country lacking any consciousness of the rights of the individual and which fails to stand up for the dignity of the individual. I mean, these ideas have been talked about in Russia for centuries. But at the same time, the US has a tendency of lumping Russia and Ukraine in the same category. But the West has a right to do that because there are many bad things about Ukraine, and the West can certainly criticize these bad things about Ukraine. 4 things I'm going to talk about that I believe that Ukraine has got as an inheritance from the Soviet Union is division, corruption, the inferiority complex, and the self-defeatist attitudes. I mean, let's talk about the first one, division. Many people looking from the outside into Ukraine believe that Ukraine is divided. I mean, you have the eastern regions that are pro-Russian and the western regions that are pro-Ukrainian. In reality, all of Ukraine and even certain areas of the Kuban region, which is right now part of Russia, have always been pro-Ukrainian. They have always spoke exclusively Ukrainian in these lands, and like I said, the Kuban region of Russia, they have a Ukrainian dialect where some of the words that they use are exclusively and Ukrainian. If you look at the national clothes of Ukraine, the Vyshyvanka, all of the areas of Ukraine, including Crimea, they have this the embroidered shirt that are Ukrainian. I remember that when I was a child taking a bus in Crimea, a large percentage of the people in this bus were singing Ukrainian songs. They were singing patriotic Ukrainian songs. They were wearing vyshyvankas. It was visible there, even to me at that time. At the same time, you always keep hearing that the eastern Ukraine is predominantly Russian-speaking. But why is that? The answer to that is a Holodomor, which is a famine targeted at Ukrainians that was perpetuated by Stalin between 1932 and 1933. People forget that concurrently with that, in 1933 alone, over 200,000 ethnic Russians and Belarusians from the north were resettled into the southern area of Ukraine. And we're only talking about 1 or 2 years, right? Because in reality, this was a much larger trend of the population transfer across the Soviet Union, but Ukraine has suffered the most from this population transfer because there was such a huge amount of people that were ethnic Russians that got settled in the southern and southeastern part of Ukraine. But anyways, according to a number of research papers and publications, this resettlement of 1930s in southern and southeastern Ukraine has irreversibly changed the national and cultural fabric of society in that area. I mean, to prove the fact that eastern Ukraine was very much pro-Ukrainian, and there were indeed Ukrainian speakers in that area that they thought that Ukraine is Ukrainian, you can read about Vasyl Stis, who was a prominent poet, Ukrainian lecturer, and journalist that was imprisoned by Russia for 13 years. And well, that was Soviet Union back then, but you get my point. He was imprisoned for 13 years, and he died in prison for his poems, for his outspoken Ukrainian position, and of course his criticism for the Soviet Union. The number 2 thing we're going to talk about is corruption. This is another thing we always hear about Ukraine from Western media over the last 20, 30 years, right? Because Ukraine is corrupt, there's this tendency for people to want to get into a government, role where they can, be comfy, and it will allow them to steal money from the state budget and not get punished for it. I mean, this tendency was not driven away with the Euromaidan protests in 2014. Ukrainian courts have notoriously been corrupt, the customs systems, the fact that judges are not being transparently selected, and they always have ties to some vested business interests or the government in general, right? Basically, the end result was that all of the judgments that were, on big cases that had to go to the Supreme Court they always had this predetermined sort of verdict that it always had to serve a vested interest or some business group. That's why you had no investment. And this greatly impacted not the economy of Ukraine, but also the image of Ukraine as well, which is why you keep hearing that Ukraine is such a corrupt country, and it's the most corrupt country in Europe, right? And unfortunately, Ukraine has been under the thumb of the Soviet Union for its entire modern economic history, and we cannot really judge the fact that without the Soviet Union, Ukraine could have been less corrupt. I mean, it is true, right? It's objectively true that ever since 1991, when Ukraine became independent, it has been bogged down by Soviet-style corruption, bureaucracy, favoritism, right? Economic mismanagement, and of course Russian interference, right? Because Russia always interfered in Ukraine. No matter what happened, there was always a fifth column. It was always there, and you can see it throughout basically the leadership of Ukraine. Between 1991 and 1994, the Soviet Union was strong. I'm pretty sure that all of Ukraine had the Politburo in it that was pretty much preserved from the Soviet times. You had some scandals here and there. And then in 1994, the president of Ukraine became Leonid Kuchma, but he quickly became corrupt. I mean, Russia could work with him rather than somebody else who could be more pro-Western, who may want to repeat some of the Western approaches to rule of law and the court system and so on and so forth. During the Orange Revolution in 2004, when Yanukovych was running against Yushchenko, which was a more pro-Western, more pro-democracy, more pretty much pro-European president. The reason there was so much chatter around that, the reason why Russia was so against a pro-European president, was simply because the pro-European president could use what Europe did, like take some of those ideas of democracy, of removing corruption, of making reforming the court system. All of that really scared Russia. That's why the 2004 election of Ukraine was seen as very corrupt, full of interference domestically and internationally. That's what it was considered as until there was a recount. And Yushchenko, the pro-Western candidate, won the election by 8%, but not before he was poisoned by the Russian Secret Service. But of course, the vested interests didn't let him do his job, or he was not able to really deliver on his campaign promises at all until 2010, when the Russian-backed president Yanukovych regained the throne as the president of Ukraine. To wrap it up, the problem was systemic. It passed on from generation to generation, from president to president, and nobody had the power to do anything about it. You could only play within the system. You could get rich. You could take the customs under your wing, the taxation sphere, the courts you can take under your wing, and you can just take out as much money from the budget as you could while you were in term. All industries in Ukraine, from gas extraction to distribution to logging to agriculture to transportation ministries to national railways, basically everything you can think of, every kind of sphere was under the control of vested interests or oligarchs. Basically, in all of these spheres, you had people who just wanted to extort as much money as possible while they had that position, and that money essentially was taxpayer money. It was budget. It was basically money for the taking in their mind. The number 3 thing I want to talk about is self-defeatist attitudes. I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes after living in Ukraine for 8 years. I believe that Ukrainians have a very self-defeatist attitude, and that is a basic inheritance from the Soviet Union. I mean, I kept getting asked by people, why would I want to live in Ukraine? Ukraine is such a shitty country, such a crappy country. You would never want to live here. People are just leaving. People are running out of here like a sinking ship. And why would you want to come here? And the question actually gets asked a lot to foreigners who decide to move to Russia as well. And obviously, it also gets asked to foreigners who move to Ukraine as well. And personally, that really drove me up the wall. I mean, what's interesting is that this line of thinking is prevalent in Russia, but it's not prevalent in Poland or Estonia or Lithuania or Latvia. Why is that? Well, the simple answer to that is because Poles are proud of their country and Russians aren't. I mean, Russians are proud on surface level, but they're not proud deep inside, right? On a subconscious level, they're not proud of their country. And again, these apathetic attitudes can be more vividly and strongly observed in the southern and southeastern areas of Ukraine, in those areas where Russians were forcibly moved into those areas, into Ukraine. I mean, these areas were subject to mass deportations and famine and the most amount of suffering and death and destruction during the Soviet Union and before that. So yeah, it's not surprising that the Russian mentality is more like, vividly visible in those areas. And the reality is, and this has been written about for centuries by the Russian, thinkers, intelligentsia, Russian writers, poets, and Americans, and the world really. Everybody has known that the Russian mentality is always about suffering, death, destruction, apatheticism, maybe like even some masochism even as well. And basically this cult of countrywide suffering and slave mentality is basically prevalent in Russia across the whole country. And I'm not talking about the Soviet Union, Lenin, and Stalin, and the fact that the Gulag, which is pretty much a concentration camp system that was active for 30 years, that has abducted people and kept them working as essential slaves in those areas across Russia. You can trace it back all the way to the Mongol invasion of Muscovy. And when the Mongols lost to the Muscovites in the 15th century, the Russian peasants became more and more obliged to the landowners. The rights were taken away gradually over the next 50 years, 100 years. And that lasted all the way until 1860s, when finally serfdom was abolished in Russia. I mean, think about that length of the fact that Russian peasants had absolutely no rights. It was from the 15th century to 18th century. I mean, according to a book by Daniel Rincourt-Lafayette, he said something along the lines of the sheer quantity and diversity of suffering that goes on in Russia and still goes on there to this day boggles the Western mind. And I believe this suffering, this fatalism, all leads to a deep unhappiness and this deep inferiority complex, this self-defeatist attitude that is inherently Russian and not Ukrainian. Let's look at the Russian language. I personally think that, and many other linguists would probably agree with the fact that Russian language is a lot more different than Ukrainian and the Western language. Russian words are very unique, right? The traditional Russian proverbs have this fatalism built inside of them that sort of submits to the will of fate, right? Allows you to sort of brainwash, I guess, the population that this is basically your fate and this is basically what you're destined to have or to do or whatever. It's an incredibly difficult thing to get across because most people, what they want to do is they want to grow, they want to develop. Basically any country, right, any economy wants to show basically incremental growth every year. You want to do better than you were before. You want to be better than you were before, right? This whole idea about everything, right? And if you're not growing, you're just dying, right? You're stagnating. It's very difficult for Westerners really to understand the fact that this is what Russia is. Basically, it works on a regressive basis. It works on purposes and on the terms of negative selection, right? A country where the worst of the worst end up running the country, they end up making decisions that affect the lives of millions. That leads me to my fourth point, the inferiority complex. It's not a secret that ever since the Tsarist times in Russia, the Tsars were always comparing themselves to Europe. In the Soviet Union, it was America, and now with Russia, it's America and the European Union, right? This is something that's been a hallmark and a unique characteristic of Russia is to compare themselves to the West from day one. Let's take a look back at a press conference that happened 1 year ago. I believe Biden was there and Putin was there. And I remember watching the press conference that Putin did in front of journalists, American journalists essentially, and it was 30 minutes of just whataboutism and strawman arguments, and basically skirting around the questions.
The list of your political opponents who are dead, prisoned, or jailed is long. So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
My opponents being jailed or in prison. People went into U.S. Congress with political demands. 400 people are now facing criminal charges.
Funny thing is that Russians lap it up. They're we're okay that Putin is not giving concrete arguments to journalists. We're okay with that. I don't know, it just displays a lack of intellect or something. I don't know, in the general Russian public. Yeah, inferiority complex, it has made its way into Ukraine. It's this mentality that, we're not good enough for Europe, we're not good enough to be an EU member. We're never going to clean up our corrupt country. We're never going to have economic growth. This is all a very Russian narrative that Ukraine should stop repeating, and I hope it will, as a result of this war. I mean, I don't think that is a sincere statement by Ukrainians, because Russians sincerely believe that in this, but Ukrainians really do not. It's something that they're just forced to repeat because they're influenced by Russian culture, Russian media, or whatnot. There was a French guy called Christine Marquis that lived in the first half of the 1800s in France. He was a French aristocrat whose father and grandfather were guillotined during the French Revolution, right? He believed in aristocracy, so he went to Russia to argue for the fact that there should be no representative government. And when he came back from Russia, he had a huge revelation. He wrote something like, "Having now experienced a nation of slaves," he wrote, "I can declare that a peasant in the environs of Paris is freer than a Russian lord." This is something that he said. Well, in the end, to wrap it up, just recently I'll mention that Ukraine has gotten a candidate status for EU membership. It still has to do a few things to shake off the Soviet past, right? It has to shake off the corruption, it has to do some reforms, it has to do this, it has to do that. But this is all happening at the backdrop of war, right? And EU, what it's doing is essentially showing Russia that it's able to take Ukraine in what it is able to accept Ukraine how it is, with all its imperfections, with all its problems, and it believes that Ukraine is a European country. Basically, Europe considers Ukraine part of its geopolitical, geographic, and economic arena, and political arena as well. If it wasn't for the Russian war, or the invasion, right, this process would have been a lot more lengthy, a lot more time-consuming, and basically a lot more drawn out. And who knows how it would have turned out. Anyway, guys, I hope you liked this video, and it's a long one, but until next time, guys.